Hey everybody, Brian Allred, teaching pastor at New Life Presbyterian Church, and welcome back to our series on learning to love Leviticus, where we are nearing the end of that section on instructions for holiness that we began way back in chapter 17, runs all the way through chapter 26. I guess looking in hindsight at this, it actually runs probably through chapter 25, which we are going to consider the first part of chapter 25 in this lesson. Chapter 26 is really dealing with the sanctions for keeping and breaking the covenant. And then we have kind of this epilogue, instructions for dedication, in chapter 27. So we are nearing the end of the book. The book just has 27 chapters. Remember, we started with a consideration of understanding the context of Leviticus, the literary and the redemptive context. And now we're in this section of understanding the content of Leviticus, where we've worked through each individual chapter to see what it has to say to us and how we can apply that as Christians today. But remember, that third step was to understand the completion of Leviticus, and that is not just how it applies to us as Christians today, but how it points forward to and anticipates the work of Jesus. So we've interwoven that into all of these chapters and these sections here that you see: instructions for sacrifices, priesthood, purity, the Day of Atonement in chapter 16. And again, we've been looking at these instructions for holiness for a considerable amount of time. We looked at upholding holiness last time, where we had these instructions for keeping the bread and the trimming the lamp for the oil. In the last chapter, the importance of upholding the holiness of God's name. And that followed, remember, all these instructions for holy days in chapter 23. We actually returned to that in chapter 25, more sacred time. But instead of holy days or holidays that we had in chapter 23, we actually get holy years in chapter 25. And that's broken up into two specific components in the chapter. We read about the Sabbath year in verses 1 through 7, and then the Jubilee year in verses 8 through 55. So most of the chapter is taken up with the year of Jubilee, but we begin with the Sabbath year. Again, that's similar in principle to the weekly Sabbath and the festival Sabbaths. Remember, we read about those things in chapter 23. Chapter 23 begins with that fundamental day that's set aside each week for the people to enter into rest and to remember the work of the Lord on their behalf, to rest in his work for them as their Redeemer. That's the weekly Sabbath. That's the fourth commandment. But then also remember that within these festivals, there are also Sabbath days where the people are to assemble together. They're not to do any work. They're to cease from ordinary labor, and they are to rejoice and remember and enter into relationship with one another and with the Lord. And so the Sabbath year is similar, again, in principle to what we've already seen in chapter 23, but with a couple differences. One of those differences is it's obviously longer. I mean, we're talking about an entire Sabbath year. And the other difference in that is it involved primarily rest for the land. This wasn't ceasing where the people didn't work at all in any capacity for an entire year, but they did not work the ground because the land was to be given rest. The explanation is that the ground belongs to the Lord, and he grants it to Israel as tenured land. It never actually belongs to them as their own private possession. It belongs to the Lord. It's something that they've been given to steward well. And part of this stewardship means allowing the land to rest every seventh year. The land was to lie fallow in the seventh year. So those who owned land were not to sow or cultivate. They were not to prune vineyards, and they were not to gather spontaneously. They weren't to do any kind of harvesting of any spontaneous produce in the seventh year. That was to be left for the people to enjoy what grew on its own. There was no actual agricultural work that was done on the land in the seventh year. So that's what the Sabbath year is about, allowing the land to rest. One of the things that we want to see in this is that there are agricultural, religious, economic, civic, and eschatological dimensions to this Sabbath year. That helps us kind of unpack the significance of the Sabbath year in this chapter, dealing with more sacred time. So let me just walk through this briefly. Obviously, we're going to say more about some of these principles in the year of Jubilee, because you could say this exact same thing about the year of Jubilee. The Jubilee year included agricultural, religious, economic, civic, and eschatological dimensions. And so we don't want to say everything about those principles here dealing with the Sabbath year. We'll allow some of those things to be said with the year of Jubilee. But just to touch on some of these dimensions here, the Sabbath year allowed the land to rest, and it protected it from abuse. That's the agricultural dimension. I'm trying to move my face here. So it protected it, again, from abuse, and it was allowed to replenish itself. Now, I'm not a culturalist, I think would be the way you pronounce that. I don't engage in horticulture. I don't plant a garden with my family, although my dad was a farmer, my grandfather was a farmer, my brothers have farmed. But I don't know a lot about soil or any of those kinds of things. I was a really good friend of somebody who was a global innovator of no-till farming. And so I know that there's something about allowing the land to replenish itself, and constantly sowing it depletes it of nutrients. And so there's this agricultural benefit here of allowing the land to rest, allowing it to replenish itself in terms of its nutrients, and not allowing it to be exploited or abused or ravaged for human economic gain. So we have to care for the land. There's some obviously environmental concerns that we can talk about by way of application a little bit later in the lesson. But the land is important. It's important that we care for it, and there is room for Christian environmentalism. So more on that in a little bit. But there are religious dimensions to the Sabbath year as well. So it didn't only protect the land, but it called for the people to acknowledge that the Lord was their provider, and that they were called to trust him to provide for all that they needed. He was the source of their sustenance. They weren't to rely solely on the land. Again, the land doesn't, even today, right? The land doesn't produce fruit and sustenance on its own. It does so as a result of God's blessing, of giving rain and giving sunshine and those kinds of things. Still very dependent upon the Lord and his providence for any harvest. That's as true today as it was 1,000 years ago. The harvest of year 6, keep in mind then, would have to sustain them through year 7 because they're not planting or harvesting in the 7th year. So year 6 has to carry over to year 7. But remember, they're not planting in year 7 either, so they're not going to harvest for many years beyond that. So it has the harvest of year 6 has to sustain them for year 8 as well. In year 8, they would sow and plant again, but wouldn't harvest then until the next year. So we're not just talking about 1 year. We're talking about additional years on that until they harvested next. And so the question would be, would they trust God to provide over that entire period of time when they let the land rest for that 1 year and then not plant and harvest until the following years? Now, some people tried to lessen the demand of this by suggesting that maybe not the entire land was to lie fallow in the same year. There'd be regions through Israel that the land was lying fallow and not being harvested or planted or cultivated, and that's very possible. But it might be that this is simply suggested because they perceive the high demand and the high requirement of trust in actually practicing a Sabbath year. And so it's a very weighty question. Would they trust the Lord to provide for their needs by allowing the land to lie fallow for an entire year? So these are the religious dimensions to it. The economic dimensions, again, very closely tied to Year of Jubilee, which we'll see next time. But the Sabbath year prevented the formation of a class of rich landowners and lower class debtors, where there's kind of a system in which those who owned land would get richer and richer, and those who didn't would get poorer and poorer. One of the ways the Sabbath year prevented this was not just allowing the land to lie fallow, but in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 through 16, the Sabbath year is connected to releasing the pledges that were obtained from fellow Israelites when they were in need. And so oftentimes when people would enter into poverty for any kind of reason or into financial need, they would lease land to others in order for them to obtain a loan that would get them through this period of poverty. And in the Sabbath year, so every 7th year, those people were released from those pledges. That land would return and not just stay with the people because of those who were in financial need. And it wouldn't remain with those loaners perpetually, which would, of course, lead to a rich landowning class at the exclusion of those who would have less and less land. Again, more of this about the Year of Jubilee, because this is kind of connected to the Year of Jubilee, what happens in the Year of Jubilee as well. And we actually don't read about this pledge releasing in Leviticus chapter 25. We read about it in Deuteronomy 15 before they're going into the land. But it's an important part to consider about that economic aspect or dimension. There's also civic dimensions. In the 7th year, all the people and all the animals were free to take what grew on its own. It wouldn't be that nothing would grow just because nothing was planted. Obviously, less would grow, but they weren't to harvest. They were to leave it in the fields and the vineyards for all the people to just obtain what grew spontaneously. People and animals, all of God's creatures, could share in the provision of God's land that he had given. So there's this civic wideness to the Sabbath year where everybody's enjoying what is growing on its own. The Sabbath year also would allow people to pursue other interests and responsibilities more fully without agricultural demands. Bear in mind that the nation of Israel was primarily agricultural in its work. And so imagine having an entire year where those agricultural demands were lifted from everyone, of course, if the Sabbath year was practiced in all of the regions of the Promised Land in the same year. And again, there's some questions about that. But just imagine the other kinds of pursuits that would be allowed if you didn't have to plant and you didn't have to harvest. And there are two seasons, actually, in the nation of Israel, an early spring season and a fall season. We talked about that in chapter 23. So all of those responsibilities and duties are lifted. That allows other things to be invested in, building projects, societal kinds of repairs and innovations in towns and villages, and all these other kinds of relational pursuits are given much more time. So there's this enriching civic dimension to the Sabbath year as well. And then finally, there's an eschatological dimension, the expectation of prolonged rest of the land and release from debts. Of course, if we bring in Deuteronomy chapter 15 and its teaching here about the Sabbath year. But this is true of the Jubilee year as well, that this prolonged rest and the release from debts looked forward to a time when this toiling of the cursed ground would be lifted and everybody would share in God's grace and what he had provided of his own free will and mercy in the new heavens and the new earth. And so this Sabbath year is looking forward to not just a Sabbath year, but a Sabbath eternity of rest and release from all of our debts as we glory and bask in all that the Lord provides. So eschatological dimension as well. Very rich teachings here in the Sabbath year. Of course, we can ask, was this ever practiced in Israel? Which is a very fair question because we don't actually read about it a whole lot outside of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. I believe it's in Exodus chapter 23, Leviticus chapter 25, and as I noted, in Deuteronomy. It is hinted at in 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 29, the time of Hezekiah. These are actually words prophesied. They're recorded in Isaiah chapter 37 as well, where the Lord is encouraging Hezekiah at a time where he's being attacked by the Assyrian general Sennacherib. And he says that this will be a sign for you, Hezekiah, that this year eat what grows of itself, and in the second year what springs of the same, and in the third year sow and reap, and plant vineyards and eat their fruit. And so how is this? Obviously, I think you can see the reference to the Sabbath year, right? Eat in the sixth year, but in the second year, you're not planting, you're not harvesting, you're eating what springs of the same in the prior year. And then in the third year, you can sow and reap. And so this reference to the Sabbath year, of course, the encouragement of the promise is there's going to be time to enter into the Sabbath year rest because Sennacherib's attacks and pursuit to overthrow the Israelites is not going to be successful. And so the Lord is going to demonstrate his faithfulness through this Sabbath year. So it's hinted at here, but it doesn't seem like the Israelites kept it on a regular basis. The exile actually in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 21 is connected to Israel's failure to give the land the rest that was required. And so the Lord removes them from the land. And he says in 2 Chronicles 36:21 that now the land will get the rest that it should have while the people are in exile. It will obtain its Sabbath years and the land will rest, suggesting that the land wasn't resting on a regular basis prior to that. So it seems that the Israelites did not faithfully observe the Sabbath year. And we actually don't read a whole lot about the Israelites keeping the Jubilee year either. We'll get to that in the next lesson as well. So maybe a more pressing question for us is not so much the historical question of did Israel actually practice this, but are Christians to observe a Sabbath year? And the answer to that question is no, not strictly, not any more than we would be required to observe Passover or observe the Feast of Ingathering or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Again, these things are all fulfilled in the ministry of Jesus, but it doesn't mean in principle there's not some wisdom here. Same thing with the application of the principle of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right? Remove leaven externally, but that was to be something reflective of our inward pursuit of purity, to remove sin and malice from our life. And that's exactly the application Paul makes in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. So there are principles to apply here. And so, no, Christians are not required to observe a Sabbath year, but that doesn't mean there's not wisdom in taking extended breaks to pursue other important tasks. In fact, we actually still have these things in academic circles and in some other industrial circles. They're called sabbaticals. And I mean, you can even see the language there is taken from the Hebrew word for Sabbath. You take a sabbatical. And sometimes that sabbatical is just for rest. Sometimes that sabbatical is to release one from ordinary obligations of work so they can pursue other avenues of work, like writing or research. And so, yeah, there is some wisdom in taking extended breaks from ordinary work, either to rest or to pursue other kinds of interests. Some other principles here that we can talk about is that we should view all of God's gifts as things to be stewarded with thankfulness. And this is true of all the resources that God has given us, including land. We ought to care for the land that we've been given. We ought to care for our yards. We ought to care for the lands in our community. We ought not to litter and to just throw trash everywhere. We have to take care of God's creation because He cares for His creation. He's entrusted us with that care. So all of God's gifts should be stewarded. One of the things I guess I could mention here, just very briefly, is one of the things that we've been given is our bodies. And we often don't think of stewarding our bodies well, but that is something that Christians should think of more often, which would entail making sure that we get the activity that we need, entail eating the kinds of foods that fuel our bodies well for the activities that are demanded of us, and that we get adequate sleep that we need as well. And so those are all ways that we are to steward this gift of our bodies that God has given, something that we often don't hear a lot about in the church, but should hear about more frequently. Second implication here, or third thing we can say here under our Christians to observe a Sabbath year, is that we should care for the environment. Kind of mentioned this a little bit already, including the land and earth. God cares about creation. Remember that we're actually connected to the earth. We think of like certain animistic religions, or even Native Americans who sensed a strong connection, maybe even a worship of the land as something being odd. But of course, it's a perversion of the truth. But the element of truth in that's perverted is, remember that Adam was created from the dust of the ground. Our bodies are made up of substances and elements that we find in the soil, right? I mean, we need calcium for strong bones, and there's sodium in our cells and potassium in our cells. And so we're very connected to the ground, and it's right for us to sense this connection. It's not right for us to worship the ground or the earth or the land, but we worship only the maker of the earth and the ground. But we ought to have a healthy respect for land, for property, for the earth. And remember also, not only was Adam taken from the earth and created from the dust of the earth, but Adam and Eve were given dominion over the earth, to care for it, to steward it well in God's place. We read about that in the early chapters of Genesis. And so we ought to be concerned about things like pollution. We ought to work to eliminate and reduce pollution. We ought to be concerned about things like recycling, the use of renewable resources, not exploiting lands or resources or the environment. Again, there's a place for Christian environmentalism, not to the extreme that we often see it, where certain environmentalists would regard a tree and the life of a tree as important as the life of an individual. Obviously, that's not true scripturally. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't care for trees. It doesn't mean that we can reduce the use of the environment to something that's simply to be exploited for economic gain. That is not the biblical view. Again, that doesn't mean that we ought not use the environment for the prosperity of peoples. And note that there should be a wideness in that concern. But obviously, I mean, we get to a point now where we're using things that are destructive of the environment for economic gain, but are diminishing maybe the quality of life that we have physically, emotionally, intellectually. And so we have to think clearly about what would a Christian environmentalism look like. Again, we don't have time to cover all of that here, but it's something that we ought to be attuned to. Another question we could raise here is, what should Christians make of climate change concerns then when we talk about all these environmental concerns? I'm not an expert in that area, it does seem like you could make an argument that climate change is a real thing. Of course, there are some outstanding questions that are a little bit harder to verify, and that is the change that we're seeing in the climate a direct result of human activity? And if it is a direct result of human activity, would the cessation of those activities reverse the change of climate? Those things are a little bit harder to establish. So there's some complex questions there, but again, something that shouldn't just be off the table for Christians to think about. We should search the scriptures in the power of the Spirit and seek to discern what we make of climate change concerns that we hear about. Also, we should steward personal resources in such a way that they can be shared and that they can be used to contribute to the common good rather than to be hoarded for personal consumption and for accruing wealth at the exclusion of others in need. This is a principle that we can extrapolate from the passage in Deuteronomy regarding the Sabbath year, but a principle that's even more tightly connected to Jubilee. So I'm not going to elaborate too much on this at this point. We'll get into some of this stuff in the next lesson about the importance of stewarding personal resources in a way that is open-handed and is seeking to contribute to the common good and not just hoarding for personal consumption and the accruing of personal wealth. Something related to that, we should seek ways of preventing people from being enslaved to debt for long periods of time, certainly preventing generational kinds of poverties, generation after generation after generation, related to systemic concerns. The systems are built in that way where it just allows, again, for the rich to get richer, the poor to get poorer, and just generational kind of poverty. The Bible's trying to eliminate that. The Lord is trying to eliminate that with these laws. One of the things he says in that Deuteronomy chapter 15 is that there'll be no poverty among you if you observe these principles, because those who are indebted have to give up lands, have those restored on a regular basis, even if they haven't paid the entire loan back. Sabbath year, Jubilee year, everything returns to the original owner. And so again, we'll get into some of those more with the Jubilee year and some of the economic principles that are tied to that that could be very helpful for us, particularly in today's age when we think about capitalism, the weaknesses of capitalism, drifts towards socialism, which I don't think is the answer. But there's some tension produced there because of the distribution, the unequal distribution of wealth. And what does the Bible have to say about that? And so, again, I'm not an economist, so I don't want to say too much about that because it's not an area of expertise for me. But we do need to consider the Sabbath year and the Jubilee year and some principles that teaches us about avoiding, again, this development of a rich landowning class and the poor. So just to leave you with something like this, would you be able to take an extended sabbatical and let the Lord provide for your needs as the people of Israel were called to do here in Leviticus chapter 25? Would you be able to do that? And some of you would say, I would long to do that. I don't work in an environment where I'm afforded sabbaticals. And then think about how would you invest your time with a sabbatical, and how could it be exercised in a way that might not only give you rest, but how would you exercise it in a way that benefited God's kingdom and other people, particularly including the needy? And so obviously this concern for the needy, the concern for those who are in debt to be released from those debts is a major concern, not only of the Sabbath year, according to Deuteronomy chapter 15, but also a major concern of the year of Jubilee that we read about in the rest of the chapter in Leviticus chapter 25. So we're going to consider that next time. Hope you'll consider joining us then for that lesson. And so we'll see you then. God bless.